October 14th. The air in the command bunker is stale. It smells of ozone, sweat, and cheap tobacco. General Lieutenant Fyodor Morozov stares at the main plotting board, a vast plexiglass map of the German Democratic Republic. Green and red grease pencil marks trace the ghostly ballet of air power. His world is a grid. His reality is the predictable physics of radar pulses and jet engines. Below him, in the sunken well of the command post, dozens of operators sit hunched in near darkness. Their faces are lit by the green glow of their circular radar scopes. They are the priests of an electronic faith. Their god is the P-37 bar lock radar, a two-dimensional air search system that can reach out hundreds of kilometers. Their catechism is the rigid procedure of target acquisition, tracking, and interception. The Soviet integrated air defense system is the most formidable weapon on Earth. It is not a single radar or a battery of missiles. It is a living organism, a continental-scale nervous system of steel and silicon. Early warning radars on the border are its eyes. Fighter interceptors are its claws. Surface-to-air missile batteries are its fangs. And this bunker, this concrete tomb buried deep beneath the Thuringian forest, is its brain. It is a system built on a brutal philosophy. Massachusetts redundancy. Overlap. For every one enemy aircraft, there will be 3 of theirs. For every radar the enemy might jam, there will be 5 more on different frequencies. The West builds scalpels. The Soviet Union builds sledgehammers. General Morozov has absolute faith in his sledgehammer. His system has been tested, drilled, and perfected for 40 years. It is invincible. A new plot appears on the main board. A young lieutenant calls it out, his voice steady, practiced. Target Group Alpha. Bearing 090. 20-plus contacts. Altitude 10,000 meters. Morozov nods. It is a routine probe. The Americans and their allies do this constantly, testing the edges of the network, sniffing for weaknesses. They will find none. He watches as the established rituals unfold. The target group is designated hostile. The data is relayed to the fighter regiments and the SAM divisions. Scramble the duty flight from Merseburg, Morozov says, his voice calm. Vector to intercept. On the board, a new set of red marks appears, representing his own fighters, climbing to meet the threat. It is a familiar geometry, a deadly equation he has solved 1,000 times in his mind and on this very board. Then, the world ends. It does not end with a bang, but with a flicker. On the main plotting board, the green diamonds representing the enemy formation suddenly blossom. One moment there are 20, the next 200, then 2,000. They fill the entire eastern quadrant, a swarm of impossible returns moving at impossible speeds. A gasp ripples through the command well. Operators are staring at their scopes, their professional calm shattered. Their screens are no longer windows into reality. They are canvases of pure chaos. A solid white wall of noise erases the neat, sweeping lines of the radar. Within that noise, phantom targets flicker into existence. They perform maneuvers that defy physics, accelerating instantly to Mach 5, executing right-angle turns, climbing vertically into space. And somewhere, inside that electronic blizzard, the real targets have vanished. What is this? Morozov roars, his voice cracking. Is it equipment failure? A solar flare? The chief engineer, a man whose face is permanently etched with worry, is already shaking his head. Comrade General, all systems report nominal function. The signals are valid. The system believes they are real. The radio crackles with the frantic voice of the lead interceptor pilot. GCI, I have nothing. My scope is a snowstorm. My eyes see only empty sky. Where are the targets? The GCI controller, a young captain, stammers a reply. Lead flight, you are in the middle of them. Turn right, heading 180. Engage. Engage now. Engage what? The pilot screams back. There is nothing here but ghosts. The SAM batteries report the same madness. Their guidance radars are locking onto phantoms, slewing wildly to track targets that are not there. A battery commander reports his system is trying to engage 150 separate aircraft simultaneously. It is impossible. It is a system having a seizure. Morozov stares at the board. The swarm of false targets is not random. It moves with a terrifying intelligence. It seems to know the exact parameters of their radars, the precise frequencies, the pulse repetition intervals. It is not just jamming them. It is hijacking their senses. It is feeding them a nightmare. He feels a cold dread creep up his spine, a feeling he has not known since he was a boy in a ruined city. This is not a malfunction. This is not a standard jamming attack. This is something new. This is an enemy who has turned their greatest strength, their integrated network, into their greatest weakness. The god in the machine is screaming. The priests are blind. And the sledgehammer is swinging its shadows. This was not an isolated incident. A week later, the same electronic storm materialized over the Baltic approaches. 2 weeks after that, it blinded the air defenses of the Northern Fleet. The attacks were precise, targeted, and utterly overwhelming. The Americans, it seemed, could open a hole in the Soviet shield anywhere, anytime they chose. The impossible event became a recurring nightmare. The tactical problem metastasized into a strategic cancer. The entire edifice of Soviet air defense doctrine, a doctrine perfected over half a century, was invalidated in a matter of seconds. That doctrine was predicated on a simple, brutal logic. See the enemy, vector the interceptor, guide the missile. It was a conveyor belt of destruction, relying on the absolute integrity of its sensor network. But how do you fight an enemy you cannot see? How do you kill a ghost made of radio waves? The system was designed to repel waves of heavy bombers flying in predictable formations. It was a fortress wall, but the enemy was no longer throwing rocks at the wall. They had learned to turn the fortress guards into madmen who saw monsters everywhere. They had weaponized the defenders' own senses against them. The Soviet Union had spent a third of its defense budget on a shield that was now, functionally, made of paper. The shockwaves reached the Politburo. The old men in their gray suits, men who understood tanks and artillery and nuclear tonnage, were confronted with a threat they could not comprehend. Their military briefers, pale and sweating, tried to explain what was happening using arcane terms like coherent jamming and digital spoofing. The message, however, was brutally simple. Our skies are open. The entire strategic balance of the Cold War rested on a knife's edge of mutual vulnerability and assured destruction. A key part of that equation was the belief that a surprise attack was impossible, that the vast Soviet landmass and its layered defenses would blunt any first strike, ensuring a devastating retaliation. That assumption was now a smoking ruin. If American bombers and cruise missiles could glide through their defenses undetected, shrouded in an electronic cloak, then the nuclear deterrent was a lie. The nation was naked. Fear spread faster than any official report. On the front lines, in the radar shacks and the ready rooms, the professional confidence of the PVO troops evaporated. It was replaced by a gnawing paranoia. They began to give the phenomenon a name. They called it Prizrak, the ghost, or Zona, the zone. It was spoken of in hushed tones, a supernatural force that could not be fought, only endured. Pilots grew to distrust their own instruments. More than one Soviet fighter was lost to controlled flight into terrain as its pilot, fixated on a phantom-filled radar screen, ignored his own altitude warnings. Radar operators developed a nervous twitch, never sure if the blip on their screen was a real threat or the beginning of another electronic haunting. The mythology of the American ghost grew with every failed intercept. It was said the enemy could read their minds, that their machines were possessed. The most potent weapon in the American arsenal was not a bomb or a missile. It was the seed of doubt they had planted in the mind of every Soviet defender. The machine was failing, and with it, the spirit of the men who served it. The order came down from the highest levels of the state. It was an order born of existential terror. A special commission was formed, a desperate council of the nation's best and brightest. It was a fusion of the military's most experienced commanders, the GRU's sharpest intelligence analysts, and the leading scientists from the closed cities where the Soviet Union forged its high-tech weaponry. They were assembled in a windowless conference room in Moscow and given a mandate of terrifying simplicity: find the ghost, understand it, and kill it. The hunt for answers began. Special teams were dispatched to the sites of the electronic attacks, like priests investigating a demonic possession. They gathered every scrap of physical evidence. They analyzed soil samples for strange radiation. They interviewed local citizens, asking if they had seen or heard anything unusual. The results were maddeningly mundane. There was nothing. No debris, no strange energy signatures. just the lingering scent of ozone and humiliation. They collected the radar tapes. Hours and hours of magnetic tape, the recorded memory of the system's psychotic breakdown. In darkened analysis labs, scientists watched the events unfold again and again in fast forward. They saw the moment of infection, the clean radar picture suddenly erupting into a cancerous growth of false information. The signals were not just noise. They were exquisitely crafted lies. They perfectly mimicked the signature of a Soviet Tu-16 bomber, then shifted to emulate a flight of MiG-21s, then morphed into a low-flying cruise missile. The jamming was a virtuoso performance of electronic mimicry. The debriefings with the pilots and operators were even more frustrating. They were interviewing the survivors of a battle where only one side knew a fight was happening. One young pilot, his hands shaking as he chain-smoked unfiltered cigarettes, described it perfectly. It was like being in a house of mirrors. My radar showed 100 bandits surrounding me. My missile warning receiver was screaming. But when I looked out of the canopy, nothing. Blue sky. It felt like the sky itself was lying to me. They interrogated a captured American reconnaissance pilot, whose jet had suffered engine failure over the Baltic. He was a source of intense hope. He would know the secret. He was strapped to a chair in a Lubyanka basement, the questions coming at him relentlessly. What is the weapon? What is its name? How does it work? The pilot, a man trained to resist, told them nothing of value. He spoke of a pod on his wing, an ECM pod. He said he just flipped a switch when he was told to. He had no idea how it worked. He was just a driver. The interrogators did not believe him. They assumed he was a master of counterinterrogation. The truth, that the system was so complex and automated that the pilot's understanding was irrelevant, was too alien for them to consider. The more evidence the commission gathered, the deeper the mystery became. The data was a mosaic of contradictions. The jamming signal was powerful enough to blind radars across an entire sector, yet they could detect no single, massive source of energy. It was as if the interference was coming from everywhere at once. The ghost targets it created were perfect facsimiles of real aircraft, suggesting the Americans had an intimate, impossible knowledge of Soviet radar parameters, secrets guarded more closely than the launch codes for their nuclear arsenal. The terrifying conclusion began to form in the minds of the GRU analysts. There had to be a traitor, not just one low-level spy, but a high-ranking official, perhaps a scientist from one of their own radar design bureaus, who had handed the keys to the kingdom to the enemy. The hunt for the ghost turned inward, becoming a vicious witch hunt. Careers were destroyed. Reputations were shattered. Good men were recalled from their posts and subjected to brutal interrogations. The commission, in its desperation, began to devour its own. The enemy had not only blinded their radars, it had infected their minds with a poison of suspicion that was rotting the PVO from the inside out. Trapped by decades of rigid, materialistic doctrine, the commission tried to fit the inexplicable phenomena into the familiar boxes of their worldview. They were men who understood physics, engineering, and brute force. They could not conceive of a war fought in the realm of pure information. They were looking for a bigger gun, a faster plane, a thicker slab of armor. Their search was for a physical object, a magic bullet, that could explain everything. This fundamental misunderstanding would lead them down a rabbit hole of flawed theories and futile countermeasures. Their thinking was anchored to a central fallacy. They believed the Americans had invented a revolutionary thing, a singular piece of hardware that gave them this incredible power. The idea that the advantage might stem from a new system, a network of interconnected components, and, most importantly, a new philosophy of warfare, was intellectually unreachable. Their own military-industrial complex was geared towards producing discrete objects, a tank, a radar, a missile. It did not think in terms of integrated, adaptive systems. And so, they hunted for a phantom. The first and most dominant theory was that of this super jammer. The commission postulated that the Americans had developed a massive, specialized aircraft, a flying power station dedicated solely to electronic attack. They envisioned a converted bomber or cargo plane, its fuselage crammed with powerful transmitters and a small nuclear reactor to power them. This phantom aircraft, they believed, would fly at a great distance, using its immense power to simply overwhelm their entire radar network with raw, brute force noise. Based on this theory, they launched a frantic search. Long-range interceptors were tasked with flying to the very edges of their detection range, hunting for this single, high-value target. Intelligence assets were dedicated to finding any evidence of a new, large aircraft in the American inventory. They found nothing. The superjammer did not exist. The second theory was more subtle. It proposed the existence of stealth drones, perhaps. The analysts argued. The Americans were not jamming from a distance, but from within. They imagined small, radar-invisible drones being released by a mother ship. These drones would penetrate the defensive screen undetected and then, once inside, begin broadcasting their deceptive signals, sowing chaos from the heart of the network. This explained why the jamming seemed to come from everywhere at once. This led to a new set of feudal orders. Air patrols were intensified, with pilots ordered to visually scan the skies for these tiny, phantom drones. Low-level air defense systems, normally reserved for attacking helicopters and ground attack jets, were put on high alert. The result was a series of tragic friendly fire incidents as nervous gunners fired at weather balloons, flocks of birds, and even their own returning aircraft. The hunt for invisible drones only added to the chaos. As the pressure mounted and rational explanations failed, more exotic theories began to gain traction in the desperate atmosphere of the Commission. A fringe group, led by a physicist with a flair for the dramatic, proposed the idea of psychotronic weapons. They argued that the Americans were using directed microwave energy not to jam their equipment, but to directly influence the minds of their operators. The ghost targets, they claimed, were not on the screens. They were hallucinations beamed directly into the brains of the radar crews. This theory, born of pure science fiction, was taken seriously enough that medical teams were dispatched to conduct psychological evaluations of frontline personnel, further eroding morale. Another theory looked to the heavens. Perhaps the attack was not airborne at all. The Commission considered the possibility of a satellite attack. They theorized a new constellation of low-orbit American satellites that could beam highly focused jamming energy down onto their radar installations as they passed overhead. This would explain the sudden, overwhelming nature of the attacks. The strategic rocket forces were consulted. Plans were drawn up for anti-satellite weapons. Billions of rubles were diverted to a threat that existed only in their imaginations. The fifth theory was a testament to their desperation. It was called acoustic deception. An engineer from a naval research bureau proposed that the Americans were using powerful, low-frequency sound waves, projected from standoff aircraft, to physically vibrate the large Soviet radar antennas. These minute vibrations, he argued, could be precisely controlled to induce false signals in the sensitive receiving equipment, creating the illusion of targets. Special acoustic sensors were installed around radar sites. They detected nothing but the wind. Finally, there was the quantum communicator theory. This was the most esoteric and the most telling. A senior academician, faced with the fact that the American jamming seemed to anticipate their every move, proposed that the enemy had harnessed the bizarre properties of quantum entanglement. They must, he argued, have a device that could instantaneously read the state of Soviet radar systems and transmit that information to their jamming platforms, allowing them to react faster than the speed of light. They were not just fighting a superior technology, they were fighting a violation of physics itself. Each of these flawed theories led to a new, useless countermeasure. To combat the imagined superjammer, they ordered their radar crews to engage in burn-through tactics. This involved pushing their transmitters to maximum power, hoping to overwhelm the jamming with a stronger signal. The result was predictable. The powerful, aging magnetrons in their radars overheated and burned out at an alarming rate. They were destroying their own equipment, effectively doing the enemy's job for them. Their shield was not only being bypassed, it was being forced to tear itself apart. While the Soviet Commission chased ghosts through a labyrinth of their own making, the answer was being quietly logged in a climate-controlled building in New Jersey. The solution was not in a single box. It was not a death ray or a superweapon. The answer was an idea. It was a complete reimagining of the nature of electronic combat, born from the bitter lessons of a previous war. In the skies over North Vietnam, American pilots had faced a dense, Soviet-built air defense network. They had jamming pods, but they were crude instruments. Each aircraft fought its own electronic battle, a lone screamer trying to protect itself. The system was uncoordinated, a cacophony of electronic noise. It often failed. A new generation of thinkers, a mix of engineers, pilots, and mathematicians, looked at this failure and asked a different question. They asked, what if the entire strike package could fight as one? What if it wasn't about shouting louder, but about whispering a more convincing lie? This philosophical shift was the true origin of the weapon that was terrorizing the PVO. The goal was no longer to simply blind the enemy's radar. The goal was to become the enemy's radar, to seize control of their perception of reality and feed them a false one. It was a shift from electronic attrition to electronic deception, from brute force to information dominance. The project brought together the nation's top defense contractors and its most brilliant minds in solid-state electronics and software design. The core innovation was a system that integrated three revolutionary concepts. The first was systems integration. The new generation of electronic warfare pods and dedicated aircraft were all networked together. A powerful electronic warfare officer in a specialized aircraft, flying safely behind the main strike force, could see the entire electronic battlefield. He could see every enemy radar that switched on, analyze its signal, and then orchestrate a unified, surgical response. The pods on the individual fighter jets were no longer lone screamers. They were now instruments in a vast, invisible orchestra, all playing from the same sheet of music. The strike package became a single electronic organism, with a shared consciousness and a single, malevolent will. The second innovation was the true heart of the Ghost, a computational advantage embodied in a technology called digital radio frequency memory, or DRFM. This was the quantum leap. Previous jammers were analog. They could only record an incoming radar pulse on magnetic tape and play it back, a clumsy and slow process. DRFM was different. It was a high-speed digital system. When a Soviet radar pulse hit the aircraft, the DRFM system would digitize it, store it in computer memory, modify it, and send it back, all within microseconds. This tiny box, filled with microchips, was an electronic shapeshifter. It could absorb a single radar pulse and send back 10, making one plane look like a squadron. It could alter the return signal's timing to make the aircraft appear farther away or closer than it really was. It could subtly change the Doppler shift to make a fast-moving fighter look like it was hovering. And because it was digital, it was infinitely flexible. It contained a library of every known Soviet radar signal. The system would listen, identify the threat, a bar lock here, a fan song there, and then select the perfect, tailor-made deception from its vast software library. The third pillar was a new engineering philosophy. The system was designed to be resilient and decentralized. While the dedicated EW aircraft provided the most sophisticated command and control, the individual pods on the fighters had enough processing power to continue the fight on their own. The system learned. After every mission, the data was downloaded, and any new, unidentified enemy signals were analyzed and added to the library. The Ghost was constantly evolving, growing smarter and more lethal with every engagement. It was a weapon that sharpened itself. This trinity of integration, computation, and philosophy directly created the impossible effects that had driven the Soviet Commission to madness. The blizzard of thousands of targets was the DRFM systems on 24 aircraft working in concert, each generating multiple false returns. The jamming that seemed to know their secret frequency hopping patterns was simply the DRFM's high-speed receiver detecting the change and retuning its response in milliseconds, far faster than any mechanical system could. The cracked IFF codes were not the result of a traitor. The system would simply record a valid friendly IFF response and play it back perfectly whenever it was challenged. The Americans had not broken the laws of physics. They had simply mastered the new laws of computation. They had brought a supercomputer to a fight against an abacus. The Ghost in the machine was not supernatural. It was software, and the Soviet High Command, with its rigid, hardware-centric worldview, was utterly unprepared to even comprehend its existence. The war was already over. They just didn't know it yet. The breakthrough came not from brilliant analysis, but from pure, dumb luck. A Soviet interceptor pilot, flying out of a base on the Baltic coast, found himself in the heart of the electronic storm. His instruments were useless, a cacophony of lies. His commanders were screaming at him to engage targets that his own eyes told him were not there. Frustrated and angry, he did something suicidally brave and profoundly against doctrine. He switched everything off except his radio. He flew on instinct and visual cues alone, a hawk trying to catch a rat in a burrow. He saw it, a glint of metal against the sun. A single American aircraft, flying much lower than the others, seemingly trying to stay hidden. It was a dedicated electronic warfare variant, the conductor of the invisible orchestra, the Soviet pilot Dove, ignoring the phantom threats his grounded commanders were still screaming about. He got one good pass, his cannon spitting a stream of heavy metal. He saw pieces fly off the American jet before it dove into cloud cover and escaped. He had wounded the ghost. The damaged American plane did not crash, but to save itself, it was forced to jettison its external stores, including a large, wing-mounted pod. The pod fell, tumbling end over end, into the cold, gray waters of the Baltic Sea, just inside the territorial waters of a neutral Scandinavian country. A frantic, secret war began immediately. GRU agents, armed with cash and threats, battled with CIA operatives to influence the neutral government. After a week of intense back-channel diplomacy and covert action, the Soviets won. The pod was loaded onto a cargo plane in the dead of night and flown to a secure research institute deep inside Russia. They had finally captured a piece of the phantom. The moment of truth arrived. In a sterile, lead-lined chamber, the best electronic engineers in the Soviet Union gathered around the pod. They had spent months theorizing about what they would find inside. They expected a marvel of brute force engineering, a massive klystron or magnetron tube, a dedicated power plant, a tangle of thick, high-voltage cables. They expected to find the heart of a sledgehammer. They carefully removed the outer casing. They stared into the guts of the machine, and a deep, profound silence fell over the room. The first layer of shock was technological. There were no massive power tubes. There was no brute force hardware. The inside of the pod looked like nothing they had ever seen in a piece of military equipment. It was a dense, three-dimensional lattice of printed circuit boards, each one crowded with dozens of small, black ceramic squares. Microchips. Woven between them was a delicate, intricate network of cooling pipes, like the capillaries of a living creature. It was a weapon made not of steel, but of silicon. It was a brain. The second layer of shock was industrial. They began the process of reverse engineering, placing the microchips under powerful microscopes. And the dawning horror began. The line widths on the silicon, the sheer density of the transistors, were a full decade beyond their own manufacturing capabilities. They could barely see the details, let alone replicate them. Their own electronics industry, with its focus on robust, simple, and often oversized components, was a primitive thing compared to this. They realized with a sickening certainty that they could not build this. The Americans were not just using a different technology, they were masters of a different industrial reality. The microchip had defeated the smokestack. But the third layer of shock was the most devastating. It was philosophical. As they painstakingly decoded fragments of the software embedded in the chips, they finally understood. The Americans were not trying to shout louder. They were not engaged in a contest of power. They had weaponized information itself. The pod was not a jammer. It was a liar. Its purpose was to understand their systems so intimately that it could make those systems betray their masters. The Soviet Commission had spent a year looking for a bigger club, while the Americans had invented the gun. The silence in the room was the sound of an entire worldview collapsing. It was the sound of checkmate. The order, when it came, was inevitable. It was issued from the General Secretary himself, a man who refused to accept the impossible. The directive was sent to the director of the Research Institute, a single, stark sentence. Copy it. It was not a request. It was a command, backed by the full power of the state. Failure was not an option. The engineers in the institute knew it was a fool's errand. They were being asked to replicate a cathedral using mud bricks. But they obeyed. The full might of the Soviet scientific-industrial complex was focused on this one task. The best physicists, the most skilled technicians, were assigned to the project. They worked around the clock in 3 shifts. The pressure was immense. The attempt to reverse engineer the technology was a slow-motion catastrophe. They could not replicate the American microprocessors. Their own fabrication plants could not achieve the required tolerances. The chips they produced were larger, slower, and consumed far more power. When they tried to integrate them, they generated so much heat that they melted their own circuit boards. They could not replicate the specialized materials. The circuit boards themselves were made of a composite material they had never seen before, lightweight and incredibly heat-resistant. Their attempts to create something similar resulted in boards that were heavy, brittle, and prone to cracking under stress. Even the solder used by the Americans was a specialized alloy that they struggled to analyze and reproduce. Worst of all, they could not replicate the software. They had the machine code, the raw ones and zeros, but they lacked the source code, the architectural plans that explained its logic. They were like archaeologists trying to understand a society by looking at a single, shattered pot. They could see what the software did, but they had no idea how or why. The elegant, adaptive algorithms that allowed the system to identify and deceive new threats were a complete mystery to them. Their final product was a monstrosity, a crude, oversized copy that barely worked. It required 3 times the power of the American pod and generated 5 times the heat, needing a clumsy, external cooling unit. In laboratory tests, it could sometimes mimic a simple radar signal, but it was slow and unreliable. It could not cope with frequency hopping or complex waveforms. It was a pathetic parody, a child's drawing of a masterpiece. The attempt to copy the hardware without understanding the underlying philosophy had failed. The humiliation was absolute. They had been given the enemy's answer sheet, and they had discovered they were not even capable of reading the questions. The final scorecard was written not in academic reports, but in the cold, hard numbers of operational reality. For a period of nearly 3 years, during every major NATO exercise that employed this new electronic warfare system, the kill ratio of Soviet interceptors against the electronically shielded strike packages was effectively 0-1. Not a single penetrating aircraft was successfully engaged and destroyed. Conversely, dozens of PVO fighters were lost, either through collisions in the electronically induced confusion or shot down by American fighters they never even saw on their scopes. The cost of the futile countermeasures, the burnout radars, the wasted fuel, the misallocated research funds, ran into the tens of billions of rubles. It was one of the most lopsided, unacknowledged military victories of the Cold War. This secret, electronic battle had a profound and lasting macro impact. For the Soviet leadership, the realization that their trillion-ruble air defense system was a hollow shell was a terrifying catalyst. It fueled a desperate, panicked surge in military spending throughout the 1980s, a last, great push to close a technological gap that they now knew was a chasm. They poured money they did not have into developing new radars, new missiles, and new fighters. This arms race, driven by a ghost they could not exorcise, became a crushing burden on their already stagnating command economy. The quiet hum of microprocessors in an American jamming pod was one of the many sounds that heralded the eventual bankruptcy and collapse of a superpower. The failure was not one of courage or numbers, or even of basic science. The Soviet Union had brilliant physicists and dedicated soldiers. The failure was systemic, a flaw embedded in the very DNA of their state. Their centralized, top-down system was a magnificent engine for producing quantity. It could churn out thousands of identical tanks, guns, and radars, all built to a single, state-approved design. But it was incapable of fostering the kind of rapid, decentralized innovation that was happening in the West. It could not create the dynamic ecosystem of competing contractors, university labs, and software startups that had given birth to the information revolution. They were trying to solve a software problem with a hardware solution, because hardware was the only thing their system truly understood. The legacy of this confrontation shaped the future of warfare. It marked the definitive moment when information dominance became more important than firepower. The lessons learned from the Ghost were incorporated into every new generation of military technology. Stealth, networking, computational power, and electronic warfare became the new pillars of military strength. The ability to control the electromagnetic spectrum, to make your enemy see what you want him to see, became the ultimate high ground. The ghost targets that flickered on a radar screen over East Germany were the spectral ancestors of the drones, cyber attacks, and networked battlefields of the 21st century. The Soviet Union built a wall of concrete and steel, defended by 1 million men and 10,000 missiles. They prepared for a war of attrition, a clash of industrial might. But the blow that truly cracked their foundation was not an explosion. It was a signal. It was a whisper of pure information, a sequence of ones and zeros that taught their own machines how to lie. And in doing so, it revealed a fatal, unbridgeable truth. The future had arrived, and it had rendered their entire world and their way of thinking about war completely and utterly obsolete.